pleasure for me to welcome everyone to our webinar 23 on inclusive education in Europe and Central Asia, contextualizing current challenges and opportunity. The webinar is organized by the KIX EMAP Hub. Our hub is part of KIX Knowledge Innovation Exchange Program, a global partnership for education initiative developed and implemented in collaboration with the International Development Research Center in Canada. KIX provides opportunities for GPE partner countries to conduct applied research, as well as sharing and exchange on education system priorities. Our KIX EMAP Hub, which is hosted by NORAC, the Global Education Center in Geneva, works with 36 countries in Europe, Middle East and North Africa, Asia, and Pacific. Our hub aims to connect research, policy, and practice in the EMAP region, acting as a knowledge broker by linking education stakeholders across borders for peer exchange, South-to-South learning, and by promoting the use of contextualized, locally relevant research evidence that can be fed into policy, planning, and education practice. The hub does so within the framework of GPE support to national governments in the shared mission to transform education systems. Our support is then aimed to provide national experts and institutions in the region with greater opportunities to access and use the evidence and knowledge they need to improve their country learning outcomes through equitable, inclusive, and resilient education systems. And the webinar today is part of this mission. Our webinar focuses on the Europe and Central Asia sub-region, where we work with the following GPE partner countries: Albania, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan Republic, Moldova, Mongolia, Tajikistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. For this sub-region, the hub counts with the support of our knowledge lead, Jules Levin, and project officer, Veronica Muzolova, who are the main contacts for connection with KIX EMAP national teams. And it was because of demands from KIX EMAP national teams and other key national stakeholders that the hub is working on exploring greater knowledge exchange and learning on the topic of equity and inclusion. This is also a shared priority with many KIX research projects that work across our region. In this regard, one of the activities from the hub side was the rapid customized and support activity on inclusive education, in which national experts and institutions from Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, Moldova, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan share, exchange, and learn on progress and challenges with implementation of inclusive education in their contexts. The fourth presentation of today will cover the comparative study that highlights key learning from this activity. Today, we'll also have the opportunity to learn more on GPE's overall approach towards supporting partner countries in achieving better outcomes in inclusive education, as well as findings from the Global Education Monitoring reports, which focus on this thematic in this region. Let's remember that today's webinar is a first of a two-part series that will continue later in the month with a deeper focus on country-level experiences. In this, I'd like to share a thank you note to country-level partners that agreed to support this event. And I asked Veronica to please share the slides while I mention the 16 partners from 5 countries. So in Georgia, we had Cooperation for Democratic Developments. In Kyrgyzstan, we had the Association for Education Developments, the Center for Development and Protection of Vulnerable Population Groups, Euro-Asia Foundation, Hand in Hand Public Association, Skola Kol Public Association, Ukum Kalet Public Charity Funds. In Tajikistan, we had the Association of Parents with Disabilities and the Association of Parents of Children with Disabilities. Ukraine, we had the Association of Innovative and Digital Education, the Institute for Digitalization of Education of the National Academy of Educational Science of Ukraine, Olena Vedernikova's Private School Network, Superhero School, and the State Scientific Institution, Institute of Education Analytics. And in Uzbekistan, we had the Mentor Hub and NGO Sharovit Plus. Before I hand over to Julia, we'll go deeper into today's agenda and introduce each of the speakers. I'd like to invite all webinar participants to participate actively during this session by including their comments and questions in the chat at any moment, and this will be addressed during the several moments for open discussion and exchange. So let's then move forward, and it's my pleasure to hand over to my colleague, Julia.
Thank you very much, José Luis. A very warm welcome to you. I see many familiar faces. I see some new faces. My name is Julia Levin. I'm one of the knowledge leads of the KIX EMAP Hub, working closely with countries from Europe and Central Asia. And for me today, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first webinar of a two-part series on inclusive education, focusing on Europe and Central Asia. For us at the KIX EMAP Hub, inclusive education has tremendous importance. We recognize it as a cornerstone for building equitable societies and also in fostering mutual understanding and bringing communities together. Therefore, we are very happy to be hosting this two-part series. Today, we have the goal to provide a foundational understanding of inclusive education, also to discuss challenges and opportunities, more from a global and comparative perspective. And on the 27th of February, we will have the second part of it, where we'll focus on national experience and highlighting practical challenges, but also good practices from the region. Looking at inclusive education as a whole, we see during the last decades tremendous development. We developed the understanding from inclusive education from a very narrow view of children with special needs to a broad concept currently that inclusive education is important for equal access regardless of the background of a child. But moreover, we also see that inclusive education can support the social cohesion of a society and also to foster an understanding and acceptance and respect. And given the current political development in the world, it is very much needed. So today, it's a pleasure for me to welcome three great speakers, which will share their insights. It's a pleasure to welcome Wenna from the Global Partnership of Education. She is the co-lead for Inclusive Education portfolio of Global Partnership of Education, and she is also the co-chair of the Global Disability Action Network on Inclusive Education Working Group. Wenna will share the perspective of Global Partnership of Education on inclusive education, including the system transformation. So thank you, Wenna, for joining us today. Next, we welcome Lana, who is the Executive Director of the Network of Education Policy Centers. Lana has also extensive experience in participatory policymaking, inclusive education, and democratic governance in schools, with the focus on global education challenges. She's also a member of the editorial board of the 2021 UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Regional Report on inclusive education, focusing on Central and Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. And finally, we also welcome Jekatyerina Dunajeva. She is a professor at the Pazmani Peter Catholic University, and she's also a professor at the Budapest Province University. She has extensive experience in education inequality, minority integration, and inclusive education across Europe and the former Soviet Union region. Jekatyerina was also the lead expert in our rapid customized country support exchange on inclusive education with participation from Europe and Central Asian countries. And today she will share some insights where 5 countries from this region came together, analyzed policies, analyzed best practices, and Jekatyerina will present some results. It's also a pleasure because we just recently published the results in English and Russian, and we will share the resources a little bit later. So it's also a good opportunity to acknowledge the work and also to share it with all of you. So having said that, it's a pleasure to give the floor to our first speaker, Wenna Price. So yeah, very welcome, and I hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak here today. It's a pleasure to be here. So as Julia mentioned, I am an education advisor at Global Partnership for Education, where I'm part of the Gender Equality and Inclusion practice. We're very excited to be learning about the work that's going on in the region today, and to be supporting KIX globally. So we're looking forward to both parts of this webinar series. So for anyone who is unfamiliar with the work of the Global Partnership for Education, we're a partnership between government, civil societies, including organisations of people with disabilities, international NGOs, local NGOs, development agencies, donors, and other stakeholders. The purpose of the collaboration through the partnership is to support education system transformation so that every child is able to access and fully participate in education and learning. So when I speak about work across the partnership or knowledge built across the partnership, I'm referring to this process of co-production and knowledge sharing about system reform that's generated by a range of different actors. Next slide, please. So I'm going to focus on just a few key issues which we've seen emerging across the partnership through our engagement on inclusive education dialogue. And we're going to be looking at some of the issues that we've seen raised through our partnership compacts, which I'll speak about in a few minutes, and grant work, through dialogue with civil society organisations, and through Education Out Loud, which funds civil society organisations, and of course through the KIX research that's taking place globally. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So I think really we see that globally attitudes towards disability inclusive education are emerging, and they're generally evolving in a positive direction. So GPE has over 90 partner countries. So we have approximately 91 member countries at the moment, plus several more who are eligible for support, but who aren't yet full members. And these are all low and middle income countries. So what we've seen across the GPE Secretariat is demand to make education systems more inclusive. So we have a tool called a partnership compact, which is it's a document that captures country level dialogue generated through multiple stakeholder groups, led by ministries of education, and these lay out the priorities, national priorities in relation to education over a period of years, and they form the basis for GPE funding. And so through these partnership compacts, which are guiding national priorities, we've seen that among two-thirds of those prioritise investing in improving access and learning for children with disabilities. So there's scope to improve. Obviously, we want to see 100% of those featuring children with disabilities, but we're beginning with two-thirds, which is a positive improvement. The amount of GPE funding that's been supporting inclusive education increased by over 50% between the strategic period ending in 2020, and the strategic period which is about to end in 2025. As a proportion of our investment, it's lower than some other thematic areas, unfortunately. But we do see that partner countries are requesting support to inclusive education more and more, which again is a really positive trend that we hope to see grow in our next strategic period. And then also, as knowledge of different types of disability is increasing globally, we're seeing more awareness and interest among some partners in non-visible disabilities, such as ADHD and autism as well. Next slide, please. However, despite some positive trends in interest in financing going towards inclusive education through GPE, we still know that children with disabilities, of course, remain at high risk, very high risk of being excluded from school attendance or full participation due to a range of barriers. So, as we all know, children with disabilities are 49% more likely to have never attended school than non-disabled peers, and this was approximately 240 million children in 2021. And that is unfortunately an average. So among children with disabilities who are also girls, children with disabilities who are living in fragile and conflict-affected situations, or as refugees, children with disabilities who are also members of minority ethnic groups are likely to face intersecting barriers to accessing school and to staying in school. So in order to fully support children with disabilities, it isn't enough to just address the barriers imposed by society due to disability, but it's also necessary to address the full range of barriers that an individual child might face related to their gender, socioeconomic status, location, and more. We talk quite a bit about access across the partnership, but of course we know it's not enough for a child to get through the door of a school. A school needs to be an environment which is conducive to learning, so that children with disabilities can fully participate in learning and in the social life of the school. So it means that schools require appropriate infrastructure, appropriate resources such as teaching and learning materials or assistive devices where relevant. It also critically requires teaching and support staff and other relevant professionals who understand how to deliver high quality inclusive learning experiences for children with disabilities and their families. And we need to make sure that children with disabilities and their families are accepted and welcomed into the school community, so that they're supported to thrive. So children in schools need to be supported by inclusive systems where equity and inclusion are core values which guide planning, budgeting, and monitoring decisions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is where GPE's approach to systems transformation comes in. So through the partnership, we believe that systems transformation can support the removal of intersectional barriers to access and inclusion through the use of evidence and data to inform planning and monitoring of systems performance, and to support the allocation of budget in alignment with system goals, including goals for equity and inclusion. If systems are strengthened to support inclusion, this should result in more children with disabilities having access to education from pre-primary right up to upper secondary and beyond. This should mean that more children with disabilities are able to fully participate in education. And at this point, I think it's also worth noting that some children will have disabilities that are diagnosed, some children will have disabilities that are not diagnosed, some children will have a disability status that changes throughout their career. So making sure that wherever a child is on that spectrum, that they're fully included and supported right through those different phases. Classrooms and schools can also become spaces where social norms are redefined to become more inclusive, so that future generations of children with disabilities don't face the same number or intensity of barriers to inclusion and other aspects of life beyond education as this generation and previous generations have faced. GPE partner countries are diverse in their contexts and in the challenges they face. So in terms of inclusive education specifically, some partners, like colleagues in the Europe and Central Asia region, have already established mechanisms for providing inclusive education, and these governments are looking to strengthen and change inclusive education in alignment with our evolving understanding of good practice in terms of twin track approaches, moving away from institutionalization, and so on and so forth. In other contexts, inclusive education can be quite nascent, and it can be a priority to really lay the foundations of an inclusive education system. But despite the diversity of these contexts, on the next few slides, I've pulled out a few of the constraints to strengthening inclusive education, which seem to be common across a range of different contexts, regardless of the history of inclusive education. And these issues are data and evidence and financing. And after this, we're going to talk through a quick success story. Okay, so please can we go back a slide to data and evidence? Thank you very much. So often we find that there's very limited data about children with disabilities and about how the education system is supporting children with disabilities. So without clear data, including baselines and gaps, we're unable to respond to all children's needs in terms of access, participation and learning. 60% of GPE partner countries report key education statistics disaggregated by children with disabilities. Just under, so that means, unfortunately, that just under half don't disaggregate by children with disabilities. And without this data, not only on access, but also on learning, it's not possible to fully understand the experience of children with disabilities in the system or to take targeted action to enhance support. So research supported by KIX has been strengthening the collection and use of data on children and disabilities globally, and I'm going to mention a couple of different examples. Traditional EMIS systems tend to move, or education management information systems, tend to move data from schools up to national and global levels with limited opportunity for use in solving problems at lower levels, such as within schools and districts. And data systems don't typically produce comprehensive reports detailing what's specifically happening in schools, which can mean that major efficiency and equity issues are missed. So KIX researchers around the world or KIX researchers in the Gambia are working on a decentralized education management information system that empowers districts to collect, validate and use data for planning and resource allocation. So in the Gambia, the implementation of the platform has allowed the Ministry of Education to rely on individually identifiable data for special needs educational planning, in line with a policy calling for individualized planning for students with special needs. And the individual registration module for this has made it possible to easily screen and categorize learners with special needs at the point that they're admitted to the system. Previously in the Gambia, EMIS data captured aggregate data on special needs, but this has made the system much more precise. That project's also working in Togo and Uganda. Also looking at the early years, ensuring inclusion from a child's first point of contact with the education system is critical to identifying disabilities and paving the way for success throughout a child's education. So in Kenya, Uganda and Zimbabwe, there's an inclusive home-based early learning project, which has been very effective in supporting data collection as well. So this is a project which is now in its second phase. It's been extended to 2027, and it was originally designed to put in place information about early childhood education models, so looking at home-based, centre-based and play-based models. What's been found is that what's been very effective in this project is that it's been building evidence on the effectiveness of a hybrid approach to early learning, and it's been encouraging teachers and parents to support learning in the home and the classroom, in particular for students with disabilities, focusing particularly on sensory experiences. And the introduction of the home-based centres has encouraged the enrolment of children with special needs in the home-based centres and in school-based centres. And it has helped make data on children with disabilities available to officials for the first time. And so actually in one district in Uganda, the district officials have now designated the home-based centres as a primary data collection point, which has really helped support their evidence base. Next slide, please. Thank you. So budgeting and financing for inclusion and for inclusive education is also an issue that we see come up globally. So investing in inclusion makes sense, both for individuals with disabilities and for society at large, but constrained fiscal space domestically and internationally can result in limited funds for investments in education, and combined with myths about the cost of implementing inclusive education, it can make it difficult to secure resources to adequately and sustainably support children with disabilities. But to truly transform education systems to be inclusive for all, addressing financing is absolutely paramount. The costs of what we've seen from different types of evidence is that the costs of making education systems inclusive are quite reasonable, and of that expenditure, a significant portion of that benefits all learners. So, for example, accessible design in school buildings, more flexible student assessment, and inclusive education curriculum, and different styles of pedagogy benefit a range of different students, and also teachers. But a main barrier to budgeting for inclusion is capturing actual costs, as these tend to vary considerably between countries. Generally speaking, we see that costs related to personnel, so including capacity building, and of course salaries, these are likely to be the highest costs. And we've seen across our partnership compacts, which are these strategic documents capturing national priorities, and the priorities for GPE grant funding. So in these compacts, we've seen that many of the countries that are requesting GPE grant support funding for inclusive education are using that funding to strengthen the capacity of teachers and other relevant staff in schools to support children with disabilities. Okay.
3 more minutes. Just,
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next slide, please. And I wanted to speak just briefly to finish off about civil society's role in advocating for inclusion of children with disabilities. So Education Out Loud is a programme which supports civil society coalitions to engage in policy dialogue, and supports mutual accountability in partner countries. So of the 59 CSO coalitions that GPE supports, 58 include organisations of people with disabilities, though the engagements of OPDs might vary from country to country. But in Cabo Verde, the National Education Coalition is led by the president of the Union of the Blind of Cabo Verde, and the coalition has successfully campaigned for the establishment of a legal framework for special education in preschool, primary school and secondary school. The campaign began in 2016 when a proposal was first submitted to the government. It's been considered, and there have been changes of government. The coalition continued to work on the issue, focusing really specifically on 2 regions before reinvigorating their advocacy at national level again, following a change of leadership at the Ministry of Education. And finally, in 2024, a law was promulgated that establishes the principles and rules that guarantee the inclusion of children and young people with special educational needs in all levels of education. And the law includes measures to be implemented in educational processes and specific resources to be mobilised to meet the needs of each student. So it's a huge achievement. And in the process of advocating for that law, partners receive funding from GPE to strengthen inclusion of children with disabilities in schools, including teacher trainings, and provision of teaching and learning materials. And then critically, the coalition has continued to support a focus on inclusion, and now convenes an annual forum on education financing with all stakeholders, public and private, and this serves as a space for dialogue and reflection on strategies to sustainably enhance efficiency, transparency, and to make sure that children with disabilities remain at the centre of planning. Thank you. And yeah, this final slide captures some, it has some links. It will be shared later if you'd like to learn about some of the other initiatives on inclusive education, which KIX is supporting globally. You'll be able to click on these links later to find out about projects in Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, and also Bhutan and Bangladesh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wenna. So I didn't see any questions so far in the chat. So dear colleagues, please feel encouraged to post your questions directly to the chat. And meanwhile, while we're waiting also from questions from the audience, I have some questions which I would like to discuss. So my first question would target data collection and utilization. I think for most countries, it's a big topic that we need disaggregated data, and we need data to make policies effective and plan accordingly. I would like to hear from you, given the critical importance of data. Do you have any recommendations for collection and disaggregation of data on children with disabilities or in need of inclusive education at the local level, particular in contexts where traditional education management systems fall short? Do you have any experience on that? What would you recommend?
Thank you. I think it's really difficult to make blanket recommendations because every context is so different, right? In terms of how it's funded, how it's managed, and so on and so forth. I think what's critical is looking at where the gaps are and how those can be filled. So for example, something that I think comes across from the research that we've seen in different parts of Africa is actually using going kind of door to door in a way with the home-based ECE to identify children with disabilities so that data on those children are brought into the system. So a kind of a mapping approach, working from a grassroots level, I think can be very effective, with the support of local schools, local ECE centres. It's challenging in terms of coordinating, and of course it takes resources, human resources and financial resources. But I would begin by looking at the gaps and figuring out how existing structures can be leveraged to add in a data collection element.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this response. Meanwhile, we had a question from the audience. Larisa Kuznetsova, she is from Kyrgyzstan, and she asked, it's starting home, inclusive education at home, and she said she always assumed that education at home is child learning at home, it's not inclusive. How can education at home be inclusive, or how? Yeah, this is a question.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for it's a great question. So I think something that we see, so this particular project is working on early childhood specifically, so the ages of pre-primary and under. So it would be ages, I believe, ages 3 to 6, but before the age of official entry to primary school. And what we know about early childhood is that the home learning environment, not just for children with disabilities, but for all children, is really critical, because very young children are learning all the time. And actually what parents are doing, the way that parents and caregivers are interacting with their children, the access they have to toys and games, and so on and so forth at home really makes a huge difference to brain development, the development of social, emotional skills, motor skills, and all sorts of other areas. So when we're talking about looking at an inclusive home learning program, it's really it's not about keeping children with disabilities out of a school environment. It's about ensuring that children with disabilities are able to, or the parents of children with disabilities are able to access the same or enhanced levels of support to support the quality of the home learning environment as parents of children who don't have diagnosed disabilities. And so it's also part of a pathway towards supporting children to enter school on time at the right age, and with the confidence that the education system can support each child with their unique needs.
Thank you very much. We have also received more questions, but because we also already progressing in time, I recommend the following. We collect all your questions and then we have time for a general discussion. So please keep on posting your interesting questions and then we will have time later on to address them. So yeah. Then I recommend we continue with our next speaker. I invite Lana Jurko as the next presenter, please.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here to present actually slightly almost outdated research, although unfortunately things don't change so quickly in education, so I believe it's still very relevant. So as you know, I come from the network of education policy centers, which covers exactly this region, Central and Eastern Europe, Caucasus and Central Asia. And the results that I'm presenting are from the regional edition for this region, from the Global Education Monitoring Report 2021. This was done together in cooperation with the UNESCO GEM team, our own organization, Network of Education Policy Centers, and European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education. What the good news is that the new regional edition is coming out very soon, in about 2 or 3 weeks, on leadership for inclusion, and I'm sure those results will also be interesting for this audience, and I hope there will be a chance to present them at some point in this year, and we can actually discuss them slightly on the 27th, since the results by then will be out. So yeah, we can go to the slide. So you see here a map, of course, of the countries that were covered in this research and the report. And the way we collected those was from national profiles on laws and policies on inclusion in education. And of course, you will see the results will cover some examples from all of these countries, but mostly my presentation is about the recommendations from that report. So we can go to the next slide. The report's name is All Means All, and what is like the main message is that learner diversity is a strength to be celebrated, and that when we're talking about inclusion, we should actually, I got some strange message here technically, so can everybody hear me? Am I okay? It's asking me if I'm in the right channel.
All sounds good on our ends.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry about that. Okay, so when we're talking about learner diversity that is to be celebrated, we have here a lot of examples of what we mean. So it's from being from having a disability to living in remote rural areas, belonging to ethnic, religious, or linguistic minority, identifying as LGBTI, but also just being new in school. So when you look at this this list of possible diversity, in the end, it's basically every child in school. If we can go to the next slide, what we know for sure is that we need still to widen the understanding of inclusive education, and that we really include all learners. Out of the 30 countries which participated in this report, 2 in 3 countries, the definition of inclusion embraces multiple marginalized groups, but 2 in 3 countries' definition of special education needs is also linked primarily with disability. So there is still space to widen understanding in the region of what inclusion is, especially among, maybe not so much on the policy level where I believe this understanding is widened, but very much within schools and with teachers. We can go to the next slide. And of course, as you've already heard, progress has been made towards a right-based approach to inclusive education in our region. Out-of-school rates fell by half over the past 20 years. The percentage of children with disabilities in special schools fell from 78% in 2005 to 50% in 2015, and I'm sure it's even lower now. And the percentage of children in residential institutions fell by 30% in the same period. So progress has actually been huge, but of course, the aim is that we get to much higher percentages here, and that we continue working on these issues. Next slide, please. And regardless of the progress that has been made, the education opportunities are still not equally distributed. And if you look at all these examples here, maybe some just to not read everything. In Mongolia, 94% of the richest, but only 37% of the poorest complete secondary school. We have still a huge problem with in the Balkans, with Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian youth who do not attend upper secondary school. 60% of them do not attend, and only 3% completed in Montenegro. And of course, we still have issues in Central and Eastern Europe. 1 in 3 students with special education needs are still in special schools. Moving on. So one of the recommendations is that we need to put the students or the learners at the centers. Inclusion is not only a result, it's also about the experience. We know that 2 in 10 students in the region that we're discussing feel like outsiders in school. So the feeling of belonging to the school is not there. And that's almost 20%. So it's the right to be in good physical and mental health, happy and connected with others is just as important as the right to learn. Schools are the key environments for the development of children's well-being, and diversity in schools strengthens social cohesion outside of school environments. And we can move on. What we need to do also is to exchange experiences on the barriers that are still there in implementation, and of course, bridge these gaps between policies and practice. I already mentioned that in many policies, we have put inclusion very central to the policies in the region. But what happens at school level is still, there's still quite a big gap. There are many things that have happened in the sense that ushered rights-based reforms. International conventions and organizations have really helped in the whole region on this. However, we do still need more strategic approaches. And laws and policies still remain disconnected from the real life in classroom level. We need to learn from each other. This is not only learning between countries, but also learning between schools, and this strengthening networks between schools is a very important way in which we can improve the experiences of learners in schools. We do have in 21 out of the 30 education system strategies or action plans for inclusive education, and the more current data, but not 100% verified yet, is that we actually now move to 25. So there is definite, let's say, political will and the will of the education policymakers to move this forward, which is really a positive result. Moving on. Data, we discussed from the previous discussion, we already discussed data. What we always say is that we need to collect data, and we need data to make good policies, but we need to really be careful about how we collect it, and it needs to be collected with care and respect that definitely avoids any kind of labeling and stigmatization. We need to collect data not only on the outputs, but also inputs, processes, and outcomes, not just for some groups, but on all learners, and not only for the resource allocation purposes. And I think this is key message from us. Monitoring should also be done in an inclusive way, and we have a very good example from Serbia in which the monitoring framework for inclusive education has been integrated in the school quality assurance policy, so that it's something that is in the system and it's systematic in all schools. Moving on. We need also, of course, to have this cooperation across government. The intersectoral cooperation is key. Inclusion in education is only a subset of social inclusion policies, and we need this horizontal collaboration between ministries. We have this, for example, one example in Lithuania, which this interministerial work really helps identify children with autism, for example. But we also need to promote vertical collaboration between government levels, from central or national to local, regional, all the way down to school policies. And this, one of the things that helped with this is some autonomy given to school. He will mention Slovakia, but we also know that Estonia, for example, or Slovenia have a higher degree of financial autonomy of schools than in other countries, which could help with allocating resources where they're most needed. Moving on. Also sharing expertise and resources. We realize that it will be impossible to provide each school with all the resources that it might need to support all learners in need. Therefore, different types of resource centers that could be created that cover more than one schools is something that we are trying to move towards. And for example, Poland has such systems, but more and more countries in the region are moving towards resource centers as a way to share expertise. We can go to the next. Another thing that I think is very important, coming from the point of view of participation, which is so key in inclusion, is also that we need to have consultation, meaningful consultation with all stakeholders. We cannot impose or enforce inclusion from the top. It has to be also policies from the top, but also this move from the bottom as well, and keeping parents, guardians, and families informed of the rights, but also part of the discussion of how is quite important. And 25 out of our 30 education systems have policies supporting parental involvement in school governance. Unfortunately, we also know that sometimes it's very on a formal way. So there is a legal, let's say, framework for it, but how it is really implemented and who are the parents who join these school governance structures is still a question, and whether they're properly prepared to actually be effective in their participation is a question that we need to continue working on.
Sorry, 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, okay. Moving on. Another big, let's say, recommendation is about applying universal design. We need to ensure that inclusive systems fulfill every learner's potential. There is a lot of things that we know are still not in our programs. We know that LGBTI are almost completely invisible in our curriculums and teacher programs. We also know that the gender issues are big, so we still have textbooks and school materials which are not on the gender equity criteria that we want. We have an example where Azerbaijan has introduced the review of textbooks for this particular criteria. We need to adapt the assessment to Georgia, for example, but not only, introduce different ways of assessment for children with disabilities. And again, one of the biggest problems that we have in the Balkans and East Europe, 9 countries do not mention Roma in their curricula at all. So they're totally invisible in the system. Moving on, trying to complete. So what our recommendation is that all should learn from the same flexible, relevant, and accessible curriculum. And we still have different curricula taught in mainstream schools, and that for ethnic groups in many countries. We do have good examples from the region about language support, because we do have a lot of schools in the region in home language of minority groups, which is very good. The question is, how do we then make sure that this is not some kind of segregation as well, where different ethnic groups are educated in different systems. Moving on, since I have so little time, let's just stick to this slide. I think I would finish here. What we know that without teachers who are prepared to teach all students, this will never be a reality. It should be a core part of initial and in-service training, not a specialized topic. Unfortunately, we know, especially at initial teacher training, it's still not there. And it's something that we need to really put our focus on. Competencies in inclusion are usually not required for teacher licensing or certification. And another challenge that we have is the aging teaching force and a lack of teachers or lack of student teachers at the moment. So we know that we will actually very quickly have a crisis in teacher force where we will not have enough teachers. We need to also promote teacher diversity. We do have an example from Kazakhstan that supports admissions to the teaching colleges from underrepresented groups. And also support personnel are often lacking, and their roles are unfortunately not always clearly defined. So we have a lot of support, especially professional staff, working more on administration than actually working with learners or teachers. And what is a little bit of a really bad result is that unfortunately only 1 in 2 teachers feel prepared to teach in mixed ability, and only 1 in 3 in multicultural settings in the region. So this is something that I would say that we really need to focus our attention to preparing the teachers. We can skip all the way to the last slide. The next few slides were about COVID, which there are things to say, but we can skip that. Just to say that, of course, COVID probably highlighted all what was wrong in the systems a little bit more, and it created further issues for inclusion. Maybe to the very last slide, just to share the link. You can download the report from this link. I will, of course, share it with the organizers. We can then share it with all participants. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lana. I think this is incredibly helpful and insightful in terms of us thinking more in depthness about inclusive education, the reality of inclusive education, and starting first by the understanding, deepening our understanding of what we mean when we talk about inclusive education, how it links with other intersecting inequalities as well. So while I wait for questions from the chat, I will abuse my moderator's role to include here some questions that we have that we would like. I think these are questions that are more for discussion. We don't have all the right answers. And we'd like to hear your thoughts about it, also from the basis on some of the findings you have from the reports. Before I go to that question, a short clarification, because we have been seeing a lot of comments in the chat about the languages that are available in this webinar. So in this webinar, everyone is presenting, the presenters are also presenting in English, and we are having interpretation into Russian. In the next webinar, we'll have speakers that will speak in Ukrainian, will speak in Mongolian, and then we'll have interpretation into other national languages. So for those that are saying that there is no interpretation into Mongolian or other languages, this is the policy we set for this webinar, which is you can use either English and Russian. And for ease of communication, if you can use that, that's easier for us then to also address some of the comments and questions you have about the webinar. So going more, okay, while I was speaking, we have one question then. So I will read before I go to the questions we have prepared. We have our national coordinator in Georgia, Natia Pirashvili. She's asking, can you tell us about the teachers who are working with vulnerable children? Best practices to motivate teachers who work on inclusion. For example, in Georgia, teachers who are working with children have additional salaries. And I think this is something this was linked to one of the questions we had prepared, is exactly how can we support as well teachers? Because teachers, it's an additional demand that we have on teachers, and it often feels that policy puts a lot of promises, but then how teachers can deliver. So I hand over to you, Lana, if you want to comment.
Well, I mean, what research finds is that although, of course, this type of, let's say, increase in salaries or some kind of additional monetary support could be one of the motivation, but what the research finds that the real motivation is having hands-on support for their daily issues. It's being well prepared, being well supported in their professional development, so being able to continue their knowledge building and so on, but it's also having some kind of peer support from other teachers. So groups that work on reflective learning, in which they have ways of sharing the issues, those are the real motivators for teachers to stay there. So having their own peer group that supports each other is sometimes much more motivating and much more successful than actually small monetary support that governments occasionally give. Very, very rarely in our region, but it's not as usual. Financial part of our motivation is only part of our of why we do things in life. So it's the same for teachers, but it's about feeling good about what they've done, having somebody who can reflect and help them when they have issues, and continuous support, being visible to the system is probably the most important part.
Okay. I think this is incredibly interesting and incredible good advice for us to think when developing policy the way we are implementing as well. I think we have another question here just now from Oliver Mutanga, who is an assistant professor in inclusive education at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And the question is, how are different countries approaching special education versus inclusive education? And you were mentioning a little bit the stats and statistics on it. In Kazakhstan, I find people confusing special education with inclusive education. How are other nations approaching teacher education programs to train teachers? And what are the five key success stories so far? Are countries defining their own inclusive education path, or is something being forced on them by international players? I think two dimensions. First, special education, first, inclusive education, and then countries' own autonomy in terms of how they are defining their policies, if it's too much driven by what's happening outside. I think let's go into those two points. Yeah.
Big questions.
Sorry for my role as a moderator. So to keep on time, you have 3-4 more minutes for discussion to be fair and equal to all the presenters. Okay.
Yeah. Let's go for three minutes.
Okay, I'll try in 3 minutes to say something about this at least. So you're absolutely right. The confusion between inclusion and special needs exists throughout the need. I would say inclusive education definitely includes special education. So it's not a separate thing. It's an overarching, let's say, even value of education. How we then in the system ensure that all learners get what they need is a question where we can talk about whether we need special schools, in which cases we need special schools, and how to connect then those special schools to mainstream schools, so that these children, even if they are for some reasons, and sometimes it's absolutely necessary, can still be part of the society. So what do we do at connecting these schools to the, let's say, mainstream schools, or actually the learners from these both groups? So the confusion exists, and it's something that continues to be a problem, and I think only by advocacy and continuously talking about it is the answer. About how influenced we are by what happens outside, and unfortunately a lot of the reforms in our region were donor driven. And they came, there was a wave that started, I don't know, probably somewhere in Estonia, and then kind of went all the way to Mongolia of different donor-driven reforms. Some of them were good, some of them were not so good. We now have 30 years almost of experience of what happens with these types of reforms. I think as a region, we're strong enough to recognize what are good for our system. They always have to be contextualized. We know that copy pasting does not work. And it's something that as a region and stakeholders from the region, we must fight to take what is good for us, but not to take everything just because a donor, or let's say, I don't know who kind of forces us into that. Quick answer, I hope less than 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think it was 3 minutes and something. Thank you so much, Lana. I think we will continue the discussion in the wider Q&A session. And now I invite Jekatyerina Dunajeva to guide us into the comparative report from our KIX EMAP activity that focuses on inclusive education. So, Jekatyerina, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And I actually have not talked to Lana before, but much of our findings are very similar to what we just heard from her. So I will second some of her findings, and I'll present in English, but I'm happy to answer all questions in Russian or English in whatever language they're addressed. Okay. So let me begin by introducing a little bit of the background of this comparative study. And as you learned at the beginning of our webinar, the next session will be more diving into the country level. So this is a broader overarching presentation of some of the similarities, differences in the context in which inclusive education in these countries is evolving. So about the project, and that's the next slide. The countries analyzed, as you see, were Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Moldova. And we particularly focused on inclusive education for children with disabilities. And there were several themes, and these are the themes that structure the comparative report. These were also the themes that were predefined for our national experts and researchers to provide us with national reports. So we looked at the historical context, in which, of course, we looked at the legacies of the Soviet education system and its medical model. We looked at the legal developments, and in the report, you'll find tables summarizing what legal developments have taken place in these countries. In particular, they were informed with the international standards in all the cases. And then challenges, we looked at more closely. What are the barriers to inclusive education? I will mention some of them, but again, please do take a look at the report. It's also linked into the website where you registered, so it should be available for everybody. But broadly speaking, we'll talk about in this short presentation today about implementation gaps, resource constraints, and also teacher preparedness. Again, very much like what Lana was talking about earlier. I'd like to spend a little bit of time on societal attitudes, because that is very important as well, especially how perceptions are changing and evolving towards youth with disabilities. And then importantly, highlighting the role of the actors, and in particular, the way in which actors can be acting together in order to bring about lasting change. Next slide, please. So let me start with the first one, and I won't go into all of the details too much. It's on the slides here and again in the report. But as I mentioned, so the commonalities between the countries are quite obviously the legacies from the Soviet Union. Now, when we put together, when I was writing this comparative report, it had a combination of literature review that was conducting outside of the national reports, and the national reports were also added into the analysis, in addition to actually the country visits. So the results of that is what you see in these reports. So when we look at the studies, the academic studies about socialist legacies of education, we also see that there is a solid infrastructure that was inherited by these countries. That is on the side of infrastructural issues. But then education systems were very fragmented. The medical model is what was inherited in all these countries, and fragmentation also in many times coupled with inefficiencies. Yet all of these countries started their development of inclusive education with this kind of background. It's important to mention that all 5 countries have signed and ratified the UN Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities, with the exception of Tajikistan. You can see the timeline here. It's also included in the study. And that was a very informative step in setting the discourse and the narrative in these countries regarding how inclusive education is talked about at the official level. We'll talk about discrepancies, and again, we just heard about discrepancies in the previous presentation as well. Nevertheless, it is very important that at the political level, there is clear commitment towards inclusive education. These countries that we looked at were really following a more of a global trend in terms of pursuing or embracing international values and adhering to international conventions. that were informed by inclusive education. So that is seen as a modern approach of education. And these countries, of course, are joining that conversation with their legal changes. I'm mentioning some of these legal changes. You can see them. Again, the study will have a table with all of them more or less comprehensively. These I just wanted to highlight to you to point out an example from each of the country. I won't read it out. That since, let's say, the turn of the century, in some countries sooner, in other countries a bit later, there were attempts to establish legal changes in terms of the language towards education, including very explicitly inclusive education, and also highlighting the rights of children with various needs. And I'll just go to the next slide in the interest of time. In terms of the key challenges, there are quite a few. Again, in the interest of time, I am only highlighting some of them. Resource limitations. This is, I think, a very standard kind of challenge. Nevertheless, it's very important because this would be the foundation of introducing inclusive education. So sufficient funding was mentioned by all partners, but of course, it's not only the funding, but it also is the infrastructure, having specialized or accessible, really, spaces within schools, not only the school itself being accessible, but also the spaces within that, and also specialized resources such as adaptive learning materials, various assistive technologies, whether these assistive technologies are high technology or low technology, or even the range in between called mid-tech assistive technologies. This was one important gap really in implementation. Again, teacher training, and we've heard about it in both of the previous presentations, in fact. All countries have highlighted that teachers lack the skills required for managing inclusive classrooms, and the quality of training programs remains inconsistent. Some countries did better, others did not. There were also differences in terms of how and to whom some of these trainings are available, and in how frequently they're offered and where. Especially in rural areas, there was the least access to these. Learning materials, so methodological access to providing the needed assistance to children with disabilities, but also being able to adapt the teaching style in an inclusive classroom was also a problematic aspect. Some countries still rely on outdated teaching methods. They lack access to modern educational technology. Another one was overcrowded schools. So many schools still don't have enough space to accommodate children, especially in rural areas. And that, again, is hindering not only accessibility, but integration of children with special needs or disabilities. Scarce or partial implementation of legal changes. And this is something, again, we've heard about, especially in countries with democratic deficits, but also we looked at, for example, the activeness or the level of civil society engagement in some of these countries, and that often also correlated with to what extent some of these changes are implemented. Overall, what we have seen, and one of the conclusions of the study, is that inclusive education is this intricate and systemic process that happens both top down and bottom up. Top-down efforts have begun in all of these countries, and support and more effort is needed for this top-down effort to be joining a bottom-up movement as well. And this is where I think attitudes were very important, especially towards inclusive education, which is a contentious topic, and I will explain, if we have a little bit more time, as to why. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. And the multi-actors cooperation, again, we've heard about it. Let me quickly quote from a study by UNICEF, just to highlight to you the importance of why all of these actors, in fact, not one of them in a decontextualized manner, but all of them in combination need to participate. So let me quote: at the school level, teachers must be trained, buildings must be refurbished, and students must receive accessible learning materials. At the community level, stigma and discrimination must be tackled, and individuals need to be educated on the benefit of inclusive education. At the national level, governments must align laws and policies with the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. and regularly collect and analyze data to ensure children are reached with effective services. Now, this is one sentence. As you see, it's very complicated because this highlights the multi-level, multi-actor, intricate, complex process of inclusive education. So throughout the study, we also highlighted and really stressed that inclusive education is not a static process. It is systemic change that is a lasting change that will require time. So for that to be successful, these are some of the actors that were identified by our partners that were mentioned in all of the countries as actors of importance. It varied to what extent individual actors or some of these actors were the stronger force or were cooperating or really were maybe not a strong force, but were present and participating in this. But we have to see this as a coherent and cohesive process that leads to inclusive education. And actually, I've put together a study or a table, it's in the next slide, which looks at examples of who these actors are. And again, this is a very busy table, so please take a look at it in the comparative report itself. This is trying to summarize how some of these key actors are or what these key actors are in the individual countries and to what extent they are exposed to or participating in the inclusive educational process. I do want to again highlight that in some cases we have seen smaller pilot projects that then were made into broader or wider projects on a larger scale and led to some changes. So all kinds of bottom-up mobilization has been quite imperative in bringing about some change in these countries. And again, I won't delve into this table too much. We can go to the next slide so we can finish in time. The role of civil society and international organizations, again, we've talked about it to some extent already. Every country report highlighted that it was very important that the presence of international organizations, whether these were donor organizations that funded local initiatives, whether these were international organizations that partnered with local NGOs, or it was the local NGOs themselves as part of the civil society acted in order to affect one of the elements of inclusive education. When I say elements, I mean either for example, societal attitudes in which awareness raising campaigns have been brought up as some of the most important changes that civil society was able to achieve. So some of the most important players are listed here. These are branches of the United Nations, such as UNICEF and UNESCO, that played critical roles in inclusive education. But the World Bank, USAID, and Save the Children were all very important institutions. As you are following, of course, the changes, contemporary political changes, some of these organizations, most critically USAID, are not and likely will not be active in the region. So that will introduce some changes to the process that has been started in the region, and a process that will likely either need other kind of sponsorship or other kind of collaboration on an international or national scale. But this is also something we'll see in the future. Importantly, the community-driven aspect of these local civil society initiatives was very important. And again, this is where I mentioned the bottom-up importantly also needs to be coupled with the top-down initiatives. In some cases, we've seen a dialogue on the importance of inclusive education that also generated societal changes, because in all countries, this was another challenge, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to changing attitudes, both of teachers, of parents, and of the society, so that inclusive education in general, as an approach to education, as an attitude towards special needs, is able to change. And we can go to the next slide, please. And again, these are selected examples. And again, the study will have more examples and more themes within practices. I've selected two for today. One is the teacher training, and the other one is teaching resources. And as you can see, and again, in the next session of this or part of this workshop, each country will be able to present a bit more of what they're doing. But you can see some examples here. So mainly increasingly in teacher training, we see some universities stepping up, or various educational centers that are providing teacher training, or even degrees that are including inclusive education as a component of that training, or the training being focused solely on inclusive education. In terms of teaching resources, you see also some examples, either using modern materials in addition to some of the Soviet-era textbooks, or equipping institutions with adaptive literature, and also the case of Georgia, we've mentioned already, the universal design for learning as an approach to education at large is also something that is being applied to really assist with inclusive education and make inclusive education more inclusive towards, of course, children with special education and not only children with disabilities. Again, much more of that in the country report, or in the comparative report. And we can go to the next slide. And these are some of the key findings. In all these countries, the experience has been very complex, and I do not think that 15 minutes can do justice to what was done. Nevertheless, all of our authors and national researchers were able to point out and highlight some of the important happenings, both from the perspective of challenges and some of the developments that were made. And again, they're included here. And I don't know if we have time. Can I ask how much time I have left?
You're over the time.
I am over the time. Okay, I don't have any time. All right, so this will be made available, and it's also in the report. And can we go? I think I'm almost done. And recommendations. So if I'm over time, I will just stop here. Again, the report is available in both English and Russian, and I encourage every one of you to read it because there's much more information there. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer questions now or later or in the chat.
Thank you very much, Katya. And I think with the Q&A that we have now, and also with then the panel discussion we'll have at the end, we hope that you're also able to bring some of these recommendations that you didn't have a chance to address. But to get started, let me mention two things. The first one is, of course, to invite the audience to include questions or any comments that you would like to discuss further with Katya in the chat. And also to mention that our team has just shared the links to the reports that Katya was referring to, this comparative analysis of the cases of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia. So please click the links, explore further. Katya did a great job in pulling up some of these interesting sites from the reports, but there is more there. So we encourage you to refer to those, and we have it available in English and Russian. The links can be found in the chats. We then can start with a question from our team to warm up. And the first question we would like to ask, I think we'll be going a little bit into the recommendations as well. Katya, so thinking of the legacy of the Soviet-era medical model of disability that still influences perceptions of inclusive education, what do you see as the most effective ways to shift societal attitudes to embrace inclusive education as a benefit for all students, not only those with disabilities, but all the student community?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. And in fact, I did want to talk a bit more about that. I did mention in the short presentation that this is a contentious issue. And this is precisely where I think the societal attitudes are important to consider, because we've looked at actually two reports, and one of them covered Uzbekistan, the other covered Kyrgyzstan, outside of the national reports that our partners have made. And one of them, in fact, said that parents are very divided when it comes to enrolling their children in inclusive schools, and some do not want to. They would rather prefer a non-inclusive school or a specialized school. And the question is why? And most likely it seems that parents are intimidated by schools, mainstream schools, because they don't think that their child will have a good experience there, that they would be bullied, and they're not sure whether teachers have a good enough training to deal with an inclusive classroom. So this is very important to consider when especially implementing inclusive education that might be a top-down that does not consider societal values. To your question, what might be effective? It seems some of the key really instruments that we have is awareness raising, and this is what most countries engaged in, is promoting the understanding of what inclusive education means, and the crack in that might be if what is promised is not actually provided. This is where problems may arise, because inclusive education, as we heard in our speakers today too, is something that benefits us all, and this has been documented really through academic and scientific literature. However, if inclusive education does not have the proper foundation, the training, and as I read at the beginning, really it is a complex process, then it might not work as well, and that will scare some of the parents away from really engaging and having their child. So this has been one of, I think, the learning lessons in this report as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katya. I think, yeah, this is probably an issue that we'll continue the discussion later on with the three speakers. But in the meantime, let me also ask another question that just came in the chat. And that one is coming from Natia Pirashvili from Georgia, who is asking, I know you addressed a little bit the challenges already across the researched countries, but she's asking, what do you see as the main common challenges, and whether it is stigma, is it awareness, or is it resources? So just to get your sense of what did you see as the main challenges?
Mm-hmm. The main challenge, if the question is how to point out one, I will diplomatically not be able to answer and say, since this is really a process that has to happen on so many levels, one will not work with the other. We cannot implement, and this is what I think our earlier discussion was about, we cannot implement inclusive education if the infrastructure is not there. If the school itself is not inclusive, we can really popularize inclusive education, but not provide the opportunities for it to be inclusive. So these have to happen in stages. And some of these stages will require a concerted effort. So if I were to highlight the most important finding, this is that concertedness, the togetherness in acting towards inclusivity, that is the challenge, but I think perhaps a challenge that can be overcome. And I haven't even talked about monitoring and some of those challenging, but we've heard about it a little bit. And again, it's very hard to do justice to everything, all the findings, but yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All of these interlinked aspects that need to be addressed as well. Before we move on to our panel discussion, let me just ask you one question that I think could be also a good segue for those reading the reports. It's to ask you, since you have consolidated a lot of insights and challenges from these countries, what would you see as gaps that still exist in terms of research and applied research in this area for the region that could be interest to explore?
I'm sorry, could you repeat? So
Yes.
what do I see?
Yes, what do you see as gaps that still exist in terms of the research and applied research on inclusive education in this region that could be interesting to explore?
Yes, and I will join my colleagues who talked earlier. We need data. And in many cases, data is scarce, or it's missing, or it's not available because it's held somewhere that is, let's say, not accessible for the public. So the extent of the problem in some cases, or the extent of the issue, is very hard to understand because the really categorization of sometimes the students is not necessarily clear. The reporting of it is not necessarily clear, and that makes monitoring nearly impossible. So if there's a gap, that's data collection, whether it happens nationally or regionally, and also making sure that the data is, and again, as Lana said, inclusive, and that the data is accurate, and that would help us aggregate and really understand the issue further. And we've struggled with it in our national report and in the comparative report too. Even if we had data from different countries, maybe not national data, it was really hard to then systematically compare it because data collection methods, or sometimes really the accuracy of the data, was also questionable.
Absolutely. Thank you for raising this important issue, Katya. So I will now invite Julia Levin, who will be the moderator of this panel discussion and also the previous two speakers to join us in a broader discussion, continuing what we've been discussing, but looking at it across the three presentations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thanks to everyone, to all the speakers. I saw that a colleague from Tajikistan UNICEF just raised his hand. Please comment first in the chat box, and then we will try also to give you the floor to speak as a recommendation. Same also for the other colleagues. If you would like to comment directly, please first post in the chat, and then we will try to give you the floor. I think one comment is still on my mind that I would like to address is and I think it's really closely related to the inherited idea from the Soviet Union of a clinical model of inclusive education, is the terminology. And we started out with Jekatyerina bringing together 5 countries, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Georgia, Moldova, and we had a heated discussion on the right terminology. And I would like to edit something that is always accompanied by a lot of emotions. I think it would be good to comment on that. Maybe Jekatyerina, and I already see Lana is nodding with her head. Then maybe also handing over to Lana to comment briefly on this.
Yeah, a contentious topic. And in addressing that, I think I would like to reflect, as Julia has said, that we did have a big chunk of our meeting once dedicated to this discussion, what terminology to use. We did not come to a clear conclusion. I think it's very difficult really to take sides in this debate. What we've talked about at that time during the meeting is that the word invalid has been the word that describes disability and is used in even the translation of international documents. And this is something that has been used in a mainstream kind of setting too. Nevertheless, of course, the opposing side is suggesting the use of special needs rather that puts the person in more of a focus rather than the disability. We've addressed that issue actually in the comparative report as well. And I think what's important here is what we do in some other documents. And we talked about, for example, the Roma community earlier, and that's also a question there, to use the word gypsy or to use the word Roma. I don't think there is necessarily the answer here that we should represent to you all. I think it's important maybe to, what I also do in my work is to have a disclaimer saying that this is not used in a derogatory form. Nevertheless, let's say, if somebody goes to a Russian-speaking area and uses the word, going back to the example of Roma, the word Roma, it will not be understood well. It will be very ambiguous. So we use the language as means of communication. And if this is the best way to communicate to people, perhaps one might choose to use this terminology because they see it more fit for the context of communicating to a larger audience, right? But we can still have, of course, a disclaimer and acknowledge that in international literature, this terminology is no longer being used. And I personally believe that if we do that with time, we might see that change, and maybe the language will adapt to this new terminology, pick it up and start using it. For now, it just seems like this is a more comprehensible term. And if, again, this is just something, but again, I do respect all of your positions and opinions, and I think we are, again, it's mutually legible for all of us. If you choose to use a different terminology, then that will be also in many ways acceptable.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, this is a great introduction for what I would say, because I would be in a totally different position, but I'm glad we can have a talk about this. So yeah, terminology is important, language is important. It's the way we communicate, but it's also the way we express our values. My, let's say, experience, I would say, coming a little bit from Southeast Europe rather than I think it's a little bit different. I mean, Of course, 20 years ago, when we talked about Roma, everybody was saying, but they call themselves whatever they call themselves, and there are different terminologies. So why can't we call them that? But now I would say it's very much a question of you would never use a different term than Roma for the Roma. The same thing, we have the same words. So I think with invalid and all of these terms, I think that if we, as let's say, people in a privileged position, in some way, people in the position of power, because we are in some way, of course, not completely, but we do have. I in my reports, I would never use terminology which is not, we might say, politically correct, but our experience is that only by continuously using these terms will these terms become acceptable and understood by all. One thing that didn't come out of the language, and of course covering the whole region, I know the issues and I understand what you're talking about, especially in public raising awareness events. But we went the other way completely from what you said, even no disclaimers, but just using the terminology we believe. One which we did not succeed in yet is the term for what we call now social pedagogues, but they used to be called defectologists. This has really still stayed as a term which we didn't manage, because I guess it's a question of people's identity as a professional. So this is something that we didn't manage to change, I would say, as successfully. But yeah, my position would be to use the terms that are, let's say, internationally acceptable. But I think it's great that we have this discussion and we see the other points of view. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much that we're addressing it, because we already had a heated discussion, and I think it's important to talk about. Next, maybe we just make a brief jump. Before, we had a question from Quasir Munir, and he asked a question about technology and how new technologies can leverage inclusive education. And maybe I give the floor to Wenna to comment on this one.
Sure, thank you. So I think that I mean, there's real potential, right? There's real potential in technology and leveraging technology to support children and families with special educational needs in different ways. So it can be used, technology can be used for awareness raising, it can be used for providing monitoring and support for individual families. It can be used as peer support networks. It can, of course, be used to enhance different types of assistive technologies. There's a whole range of different ways in which it can be leveraged to really move the inclusive education agenda forward in a lot of different ways. I think the thing that we have to be really careful of as well is that making sure that as that technology is being used, as it's being leveraged, that it's being done in an inclusive way. So to use the example of digital textbooks, for example, making sure that it's not just the technology which is considered to be inclusive, but the content within the books or the content within the materials is also inclusive in terms of its tone, in terms of its language, and so on and so forth. And I think also being really cognizant of the digital divide and making sure that everyone who would benefit most from the development of technology is able to access it. And as I spoke to earlier, children with disabilities or children with special educational needs, families who are supporting children with special educational needs. A special educational need is not going to be the only barrier to education that many children and families are facing. So we could also be looking at people who live in very remote rural communities, for example, which might impact access to certain types of technology. So that's I think in summary, there's a lot of opportunities which are very exciting, which we should actively pursue as an international community, and we should be pursuing that through the lens of ensuring that within that development we're looking at who is accessing this, who may not be able to access it. Let's make sure that we're keeping equity and inclusion at the heart of that development. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive answer. Next, we have some comments also in the chat from our national representatives, and I would like to invite Sergey Londa from Ukraine. He asked a question, again, we're talking about data and the importance of it, of the collection. Sergey, we would like to give you directly the floor. Please let me know if you're ready. I see, wait. Sergey cannot speak, unfortunately. So we also saw some comments from Humat from Tajikistan. So maybe Humat from Tajikistan, would you like to take the floor and comment? Humat, are you still here with us?
Yes, I'm trying to unmute. So
Yes.
greeting colleagues, this is great to be part of this wonderful platform and team. I mean, I tried to write up what is possible to give the background, but I think I all agree with colleagues like Wenna and Jekatyerina have presented in their findings about the situation, particularly in the Central Asia and Tajikistan, is that, you know, we have moved quite strongly together on advocating for inclusive education, from particularly moving from the medical terminology or approach to the educational or to overall, you know, social coherent service provision to the kids. And the great thing is also that it is now part of all those policy documents that we have indicated in the chart. But just to mention specifically that, you know, in this path, we may need to kind of move forward strongly further so that this agenda does not stop to be reaching the children. And particularly in the Central Asia, where other colleagues also have expressed, you know, that great movement, you know, at the policy institutional levels, we have done great jobs, you know, doing those analysis, cost analysis, disability inclusion status, EMIS indicators revision, but then how specifically at the ECE, early childhood intervention, early childhood education centers, let's say schools, communities, these are being backed or insured. This is something that we would probably need to help further. And with you mentioned correctly that, you know, some limitations in the donor interventions in this area, then we need to be probably grouping together and then identifying the focus so that it would help at least then to leverage the state budgets to the needed areas, so that we are not much dependent on the funding. So, I mean, with the limited additional resources, I think, you know, the teams in the ground, including the great CSOs, public organizations, would move this agenda very well together. And just recently, I wanted to mention lastly that, you know, through GP KIX initiative, we have launched the very important dialogue at the government level, interministerial, on disability inclusion and cost efficiency of kids from the very early years, where you have also indicated, I think some of the colleagues, you know, how this can be cost effective if we help the child from early years to be integrated into the education. And it, I think, economizes to the government about 100 or something thousand or million, as I don't recall the number, but this is very well now accepted. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to partnering further, including the great CSOs that we have in the team here. So great to be connected. Take care.
Yes, thank you very much. We have still some time left. I would now use my moderator role. And before asking a question, I would like to read out a comment from our colleague from Georgia, Natya. She's saying, in my previous work experience, a mother of a disabled child told me that her 7-year-old daughter, who has a disability, did not need new clothes and shoes because she never leaves the house. Therefore, getting these children outside should be the first victory in every country. To achieve this, educating parents is a crucial step in combating stigma. And I think it's very closely related to another question that was posted before in the chat, and also a discussion we had within the ECA community, is the role of parents. Because in Georgia, for example, they said clearly, okay, parents are not educators, parents also need to rest, parents also need time for themselves. Therefore, the role of the supporting role needs to be done by professionals. But in Tajikistan, there's still a discussion ongoing saying, okay, parents or family are very much involved in the inclusive educational process. And we had like some discussions of the role of families. So maybe you as a speakers would like also to address this. I see Wenna is nodding, so maybe just for a couple of minutes or in a short sentence as we are moving already forward to the end of our session. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The role of parents and families is really critical, and children's needs don't start when they enter the classroom in the morning and end when they leave. And actually, so yes, parents are entitled to rest. Parents do need to recharge. But a parent of a child who has particular and intense needs has those needs 24 hours a day. And so what parents really need is support in those circumstances. And I'm sure many of us either have disabled children ourselves or have experience of seeing families and friends and relatives cope with raising a child who is disabled and who has additional needs. And there are all sorts of ways that we can provide support to families and communities within that. I think one of the ways that was initially raised was that we can help remove some of the stigma, right? So that is an important thing. So removing stigma, but also there's very practical tools that can be used, for example, technology, for example, visiting by different types of support workers, and trainings at peer support and so on. Thank you.
Maybe Lana, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, thank you very much. Of course, the role of parents is incredibly important. We know that parent advocate groups were the biggest advocate for inclusive education, and they made this is the force that moved things maybe even more than international donors and I don't know which kind of level policies. So absolutely important in many roles that they have. It is they who fight every day with the stigma and the stereotyping that they receive. So it is about, as Katya talked about, the social context and how the society sees those learners. So yeah, I mean, including parents in different types of activities, but also making sure that the governments provide support, which is more than just having children in school. From financial, but also support for carers in cases when they're ill and cannot take care of their children and so on. So different types of supports for parents definitely needed. Thank you.
I'll just say really a quick sentence here. I think for the report that I presented on, but also through conducting research and talking to parents, that parents are representing the lived experience of the community about whom we're talking. We do know that, I would say globally, there is much hesitation of involving children's perspectives because they're young, because they're small, because potentially we think about them as somebody who is not able to, let's say, coherently speak for themselves and really articulate their needs, especially with the little children. And we talked about early childhood education and care in specific. That would be a very challenging part. So the role of the parents in then formulating and articulating what are the needs, because they live that rather than us. And in our reports too, we have seen the powerful force of parents as agents of change, because they were able again to advise in many instances even the policies that would be needed, the needs that they have that must be covered that are not covered yet, the gaps in the policies that we might not be seeing, but they are. And also, actually, I think that was the example of a resource center in Tajikistan, in which the parents have expressed their appreciation that some of the educational materials were sent home so that they can engage in the learning and teaching process with their children, but equipped with the right technology. And again, that doesn't really differ from any other parent who is studying together, often with our own children. But that where the link there is providing that equipment that they might need to engage with the same activity with their children. So it is very critical to involve the parents in many of these steps. And it's good to see that these processes are happening, and it would be good to also learn from, some of these ways and links in which parents are tied into the process of change.
Many thanks for addressing this comment and question. Okay, for now we are like already 10 minutes before the ending of the session. I would like to use the time for one final question, and I would like to use for the technology. We're talking about currently technology. I would like to use a Mentimeter. And next, in 2 weeks, this time, on the 27th of February, we will have the second part of the series where we will have national representatives across Europe and Central Asia in the format of a roundtable presenting the experience, the national experience and policies on inclusive education. And therefore, I would like to invite everyone to click on the link and also ask what are some of the most significant achievements in inclusive education in Europe and Central Asia in recent years. And I already see some comments like hello, but maybe in few words, if you could share with us some major achievements, which we will also like to use in our next session to discuss national perspectives and see the results and discuss the results of the tremendous work that has been done in the recent years. So access. Okay, maybe can we share the Mentimeter results for a few moments? Check. Okay. I see. Yeah, we have only 3 responses so far, so please feel free. Yeah, okay. Let me check. Yeah. And if I'm presenting it, can you share it now? Can you see it? But it's not closed, right? You can still post. Yeah. So you can still post it. But I see access is something that really, I think Lana can also agree, access to inclusive education really made great progress. Awareness is also, I think, an important aspect of it. That's correct. Okay. So it might take some time. So I would suggest maybe for now we move on, and we will still please continue to answer, because we will pick on that during our next session. And we are very much interested in your perspective on the achievements on this. Meanwhile, I would like to take some moment. Maybe we can close the. There are more and more coming. Yeah, it takes some time. Okay. Okay, policy already exists in the most of the CA countries, but every country struggles at the school and classroom levels. Yes, this is also, we also touched upon this during our today's session, that the reality at the school level looks sometimes different than the policies intended. Okay, there's lots of trainings going on, and also on the local level, policies are brought into action. That's good. Strategic programs are developed. That's also very nice. Yeah, okay. I would say that we are for now close the sharing presentation. Many thanks for your comments. Please continue to comment on this. We will get back to it during the next session. I would like to take the opportunity to thank all the presenters for making time and sharing your insights. It was a very valuable contribution to all of us. And also to thank to all the colleagues present from the from our national partners and also from all the countries. Many thanks for contributing, sharing your insights and comments. And we hope to welcome you back in 2 weeks' time to discuss national perspectives. And now I'm handing over to Marina for closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Julia. I would like to, of course, extend the thank you notes to our great speakers for not only sharing a lot of the insights that you have collected, but also for enacting a lot of important discussions that we hope will continue. As we mentioned throughout this session, there will be a next webinar. This is a webinar in 2 parts. So we had this webinar today, and we'll have a next session in the 27th of February. And in that session specifically, we will go a little deeper into the national example. So we'll have national experts sharing some of the successful stories, experiences, and we hope that this will be a true opportunity to exchange knowledge with those experts and to learn more about the context, but also to share among the different participants on the existing challenges, but also what are the opportunities to address those challenges across the region. So with that, let me also say that we have a post-event survey that we are distributing. So we would like to learn from you on what was useful about this webinar, but also what is it that we can improve. So it's very important to us, and this will also help us tailor the following sessions that will come. And of course, this is a really important area of work for the Hub. So we hope to continue exploring this topic, not only in the next webinar, but also in other opportunities, and making connections also with what is happening at the country level. So one example of this, we heard a little bit from Tajikistan on how things are developing at the national level, the policy process that is going on into advancing inclusive education for the country. So we encourage you, KIX EMAP country representatives, to also reach out to the Hub to connect related to these policy moments, and to also understand how is it that the Hub's work can contribute to the evidence that you're putting together and to any specific needs of these policy development processes. With that, you have seen on screen here, you have the QR code to the post-event survey. We'll also share the links with you. So please share with us your thoughts. And let me also take the chance to thank not only our speakers, but also some of the partners that we had in these events. And I ask Veronica to put up the slide with our partners, please. And let me say a quick modification to what we mentioned in the beginning. We had also 2 new partners from Mongolia, so also make reference to them. They're joining not only this webinar, but they're also partnering for our next webinar, in which we will hear the experiences from countries. So in total, we had 18 partners from 6 countries in the Europe and Central Asia region in this webinar, and for the next one as well. From Georgia, the Cooperation for Democratic Development. From Kyrgyzstan, the Association for the Economic Development, for the Education Developments in Kyrgyzstan, the Center for Development and Protection of Vulnerable Population Groups, Eurasia Foundation of Central Asia, Hands in Hand Public Association of Parents of Children with Autism, Kula Kul Public Association, Ukrum Kelets Public Charity Fund. And again, from Mongolia, We had two associations as well, the Adzina Equal Opportunity NGO, and also the Association of Parents with Differently Abled Children. We also had two partners from Tajikistan, Association of Persons with Disabilities, Merkabah, sorry if my pronunciation was not accurate, and then the Association of Parents of Children with Disabilities. We also had 6 organizations from Ukraine partnering with us for this webinar and also for the next one, which is the Association of Innovative and Digital Education, the Institute for Digitalization of Education of the National Academy of Education, Sciences of Ukraine, Olena Vedernikova's Private School Network, the Superhero School, and the State Scientific Institute of Educational Analytics. And last but not least, we also had 2 partners from Uzbekistan, the Mentor Hub, and also the NGO Shadoy Plus. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for your great contributions to this webinar, and please make sure that you're joining our next session on this topic so we can continue this important discussion and exchange among countries on inclusive education.